Hello and welcome to another daily devotion. As this week we talk about the United Church of Christ and some of our history, what makes us who we are, and some of the roots that we have as a denomination. So, if you ever wanted to learn more about the church that you go to locally in a historical sense, well, you found the right week to be listening to the daily devotions. So imagine, this is something I use with our confirmation classes every year. Imagine you're living in 1780, so just after the Revolutionary War, and a free black man who has been ordained comes to your lily white Connecticut church in Torrington, Connecticut, after you've just lost your pastor, and says, I feel called to ministry and I'd like to be the pastor of your church. Now, again, no succession, no civil war. We're almost 100 years before that. Well, the good folks of the church council or admin board or presbytery or elders, whatever they called themselves at Torrington Congregational Church at the time, decided, yes, Lemuel Haynes is the guy we want as our pastor. Born of a white mother and a black indentured servant who got his freedom, father, a slave, and he became their pastor. And people in the United Church of Christ say, look at this. Look at this. We called the first person of color in the United States to be an ordained minister in any denomination, which is great. However, before we get all excited about it, know that the good people of Torrington burnt the church to the ground within 2 weeks after they called Reverend Lemuel Haynes to be their pastor. And I wonder sometimes if some of the people with the torches and kerosene weren't some of the church members themselves. But the point of sharing that story is all along the Church of Christ has been this concern of inclusion and of fairness and rightness. And along that same trajectory then, from 1785, when Lemuel Haynes was the first black person called in any United States congregation to serve in any church, there was another man by the name of Sam Sewall. And just 30 years later, I'm sorry, not 30 years later, 80 years earlier in 1700, he began to start the seeds of the abolitionist movement. And by that I mean, in 1700, he began to preach sermons in his churches saying that slavery was wrong. Now, again, he's in New England, so he's not like he was in, the plantations down in Savannah or Georgia, Georgia or South Carolina or Louisiana. But he was challenging one of the economic machineries that, in terms of cotton, was the cash king of the South, and vehemently defended both biblically, because the Bible said you could own slaves, right? I mean, Southerners were on the right side of the biblical argument. And Sam Sewall had the tenacity and the courage and the self-definition to say, on the whole of Scripture, the way we're treating these people as chattels, buying and selling them and working them to death is wrong. And so you have that trajectory all the way to the civil rights marches, and of which our church participated in, Underground Railroad, of which several of the founding families of First Congregational United Church of Christ, way back when, over 152 years ago now, started to participate as stops in Aurora, in Downers, as parts of the Underground Railroad. If you go into the church today and you look on facing forward, you look on the left-hand side of the stained glass, you'll see depictions of slaves being ushered by members of the church to freedom on their way to Canada and freedom. So that work, that rootedness, that thread weaves very strongly both in our denomination in terms of equality and trying to see every person, regardless of color, as made in the image of God, but also locally, that this is an extremely important part of our local church at First Congregational, marching for freedom of the airwaves in the 60s. And we'll talk about the Immokalee workers a little bit later, but all those kinds of important pieces. And even last year in the summer, over racial tensions, and having a march, a peaceable protest in Downers Grove, a march that spoke to racial injustice. So that thread from 1700 all the way to today, and Lemuel Haynes, who went on to have a 35-year career in the ministry. God bless him, and God bless you as we look at different aspects of what makes us the United Church of Christ.